Are atheists closer to the truth than believers? That's the topic. Yes. Now, so I hope everybody here can take a little irreverent conversation about God, but I believe that having a candid and frank discussion on these matters is far better than just avoiding the discussion of, this three-letter word called God, G-O-D, is fraught with more opinions, disagreements, arguments, wars have been fought, misconceptions than any other word in our vocabulary. There are passionate believers and there are passionate non-believers. There are people who are ready to die for and kill others in the name of God, and there are other people who are ready aggressively to attack anyone in the name of no God. So when you have such diversity, really you have to get back to the question is there really a disagreement? And perhaps the first thing to do is define what do we mean by God. Because if we have different definitions, we clearly are never going to be able to come to terms whether we believe or not believe in something without first defining the axiomatic definition of what the meaning of God is. Rabbi Yitzchak Badishever put it really powerfully when he said to a self-proclaimed atheist, he said to him, the God you don't believe in, I also don't believe in. Which essentially means that first you have to define what God means. Now, every human being on earth fits somewhere on the spectrum. As I said, there is between the extremes of radical believers and radical atheists. You have moderate atheists, I've come to learn. You have radical and moderate agnostics. You have moderate believers. And everyone fits in somewhere there. But, as I'll suggest here, I think that many of the ideas around God and all the implications of God are really filled with many prejudices and just locked in positions without really thinking about what we're saying or what we're believing in. Because take, for example, this phenomena. People who say, I absolutely believe in God, and yet they behave in a way that's antithetical to God. And then you have someone else who can say, I don't believe in God, and they behave in a far more noble and ethical way than the so-called believer does. So what do these words mean? Just because somebody says they believe, but if their actions are not consistent with what they believe, and someone else says, I don't believe, and their actions are very fine, very refined, like a godly person, so then what do these words mean anyway? Is it just like slogans? Some people belong to this club and that club. Maybe it should be measured by actions. And if measured by actions, I would think that there are very few believers that really can say that 24/7 they live their lives as if God is right near them, and every action and every word that comes out of their mouth and every thought they have is guided by that principle. I would challenge anyone to find a person like that. So to say that one believes in God and say one does not believe, does that have any significance? Does it have any meaning? Now let's take this a little further. A little more philosophical even. Say God exists, one has to really define what does the word exist mean. What does the word exist mean? For example, if you said, does love exist? Someone will say, well, based on empirical evidence of the five senses, you can't prove that love exists. Just like you can't see subatomic particles. So the word exists is also a very deceptive word. For one person something exists, for another person on a different level it doesn't exist. We see physical objects in this world. We could see with our eyes, we hear sounds, we taste, touch, and smell. But none of those five senses can capture what a molecule or an atom or a subatomic particle looks like. So then you have to define what the word exists means. Just because you can't see something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. And what criteria do we use? If you take even a step further, the real quandary is this. If indeed there is a creator, I'm only saying if to satisfy the skeptic. If indeed there is a creator, can the creature really be the one that defines whether there's a creator or not? Is the creator that creates the creature, not the creature that creates the creator? So what can a creature really say about its creator? What can a piece of art say about the artist? It's a product of the artist. Let's go further. All logic and reason, if indeed there's a creator, the creator also created logic and reason. So to use logic and reason to try to understand the creator is a contradiction of terms. Because you can't bind the creator of logic and reason to the laws of logic and reason. In the words of physicists, something within a system cannot understand something outside of the system. Can we really perceive something outside of our own structure? So then we get ourselves into a complete new dilemma, which is any God we talk about is really a God only simply based on our terms. What we determine is the context and so on. It may not even be what God really is, because we're the ones talking about. Think of it this way. If we're part of a whole reality, how much can the part tell us about the whole when you're only a part? You're only one little piece of it. So there are much more dilemmas than one think when you talk about God, even though people so flippantly talk about God exists, I do believe, I don't believe. And then, of course, the fact is that if it was so simple to prove or disprove God, then we'd have no argument, would we? Clearly, it's not that simple. All the proofs are rejected by people who don't want to accept those proofs. And the disproofs are rejected by people who do accept the proofs. So then what are the proofs worth? It's just a matter of choices. And you see that as a fact. You see the way they look at the world. So in a sense, it's like a circular type of argument because you get nowhere. There are people who believe, and those that don't. And you could argue that belief is very much part of culture. Some people grew up with that, and therefore it's comfortable for them to believe in God. And some didn't. Or you could argue the other way around. Those that grew up with it may be the ones that rejected because they saw how hollow or hypocritical it was. So they're prejudiced the other way around. Anyway, as you see, basically, subjectivity comes into play big time in this discussion. So throwing out all these questions, my goal is really to be provocative, intentionally, and most importantly, to be able to address this in an intelligent manner, to say what can we know, what can we not know. Because there's no question in the world that just like a piece of art can tell you very little about the artist. It can tell you that the artist has the capacity to create such art, but what else can it tell you about the artist? If the art was able to speak. Just like a computer or any machine, what can it tell you about its engineer? Very little, because they're not in the same reality. So the question is, do we have even the tools to talk about God? And if we do talk about God, is it not merely simply another God that's an extension of our way of thinking? A God that we decide we need, a crutch, something that we feel gives us solace or comfort, etc., etc. So I decided to address this week for the reason being, because in this week's chapter in the Torah, there's a double chapter, Achrei Kedeshim, and the second of the double chapter, Kedeshim, starts, Kedeshim Tiyu, you shall be sanctified. Sanctify yourselves. Kedeshim Tiyu, you shall be sacred. It's a commandment. Ki Kadeshani, because I, God, am sacred. The Medrash, the Medrash is the oral interpretation of this verse says, Taras Kohanim on Leviticus, on this verse, that what's the meaning of the word be sacred, because I am sacred? So it says because Kedeshim Tiyu Yochel, you could think that Kameni, that you could be as holy as God is. And the Medrash says no. Talmud Lema comes say Ki ani ki kadeshani kedushasi l'mayla mikdushaschem. My holiness is higher than yours. Which of course begs the question, what's the point the Torah is trying to tell us that God is holier than us? I mean, if someone believes in God, that's obvious. So there's an interesting Hasidic interpretation that actually turns around the Medrash and says something quite radical. It says the way you're supposed to read it is, Yochel Kamoyin, not a question, you may think that you're as holy as God. That's actually read as a statement. You can be as holy as God. Why? Kedushasi l'mayla, not l'mayla is interpreted as my holiness is greater than yours, but Kedushasi l'mayla, my holiness above, is Mikdushaschem, is derived from and comes from your holiness. In other words, you sanctify me. Which turns the whole meaning around, that basically we have the power essentially to make God holy or to desecrate God. So reading that, I just thought it was appropriate. It could be any week, this topic, just to talk about God and our relationship and understanding of the whole concept and so on and so forth. You want to say something?
Well, I wanted to ask, you said before that you
Okay, so then I'm asking you, so 24/7 do you live without God, and have you ever done something that's not godly? If it's so,
If you could prove it.
no, I'm saying if it's so provable, why is it that you can behave or I can behave in a way that goes against that? So even if you have that's a nice argument, and then there are many who just reject it. They have many explanations otherwise. It was a rhetorical question. Now, so taking all this into account, I think it's important to first establish a few things. If, I'll go now with the argument, if there is no God, if the universe is some way evolved on its own, and that ball of gas that goes back 12 billion years ago, whatever, either created itself or was always there, however you explain that. Right? Then, of course, obviously, with that type of approach, then all we have is ourselves and our own minds, and you can't really go very far with that as far as God goes, because you've determined that we're self-made creatures. And really there's no discussion if a person accepts that. Obviously there are many mysteries still to the left, because even if you can explain how those gases evolved into forms of life, you still have to explain how the gases got there. And as you just said accurately, one of the arguments in the Kuzri and other books is the concept of Ein Dover Eises Atzmei, nothing can create itself. There's nothing in existence that's self-made. Every one of us is the product of parents. Our parents are the product of parents. Every species, everything on earth comes from some previous form. So then it leads us to say that the earliest form could also not have created itself, because we're made of the same substance. That first cause, so to speak, has to have a cause before it, which is the conventional argument of nothing can create itself. Now, many scientists and others choose to reject that argument, because I believe it's not purely because of logic, because there's also another factor. And I've talked about this to a number of scientists that consider themselves atheists. I said, I know you accuse believers of being closed-minded. A believer just believes, and no proof in the world is going to shake that belief. Right? Whereas a scientist is a person who should be able to be open to all arguments, whether for God or against God, without any prejudice. But there's one question here. We all know that in any type of intelligent argument, there has to be what we call full disclosure. Right? We have to be transparent. Now, in a court of law, the first question that you would ask about any given issue is, the parties involved, do they have any bias or any interest in a resolution that is either one way or the other way? If a judge, for example, is invested financially or otherwise because of a relative in the verdict being guilty or not guilty, he or she has to recuse themselves because they're biased. Now, this God issue has a lot of bias involved. Number one bias is that if there is indeed a God, it would compel us to be accountable. Who wants to be accountable? So we all have invested interest, because if there is a God and it's absolute so, and God put you here, then that would compel us to accept that we are responsible to God. I think many people are invested in making sure they're not responsible and accountable. So I've asked a number of scientists, why don't you make that statement before you make your argument? Say, you know something? I have benefit to believe that there is no God, because then I can do what I wish. So just like you're expecting believers to be open and transparent and say we have biases because either we believe because we grew up that way, or because we believe because it makes us easier to deal with pain, or whatever it is, why don't you say the same thing, that you have interest involved in the fact that there is a conclusion that can have consequences. And therefore that would somewhat bias you to try to argue there is no God. Like you'll often hear the argument, very often, that in the primitive times people had no other way of explaining phenomena except with God. If there was an earthquake, if there was a hurricane, if there was something else that happened, it had to be God's hand. But today that we have natural ways to explain it, scientific ways, we don't need God. That's one of the arguments against God. But that's a very limited perspective on God. There's many other reasons that you could come to God, even with a world like ours. Like I just mentioned, the argument of nothing can create itself. But above all, we all are looking for ways to make our lives more comfortable. If you had a choice to be accountable or not accountable, which one would you choose? If you really had complete choice, and you're honest. Most people would rather be less accountable, let's be honest. Maybe at times, we like the idea to be responsible to someone. But on our terms, especially when it comes to personal matters. So I searched and searched. I wanted to see if there's any scientist ever in history who argued against God that was ready to say, be open. Now believers, you're going to find a lot of closed-minded believers who are not ready to be objectively describe why they believe. But believers can be dismissed because they're not using logic. But a scientist and a thinker and a free thinker is following logic. So if he's following logic, why does he not accept that element? So I did find one. Aldous Huxley. I'll paraphrase because I don't remember the exact language. It's quite eloquent. He writes the following. He was an agnostic, maybe even an atheist. I don't remember what he called himself. So what did he write? What did he write? He wrote the following. I'm invested in the fact that there should be no God, because then I can do it as I wish, especially in the area of sexuality. These are his words, pretty blunt. And therefore, all my arguments follow that my first axiom. Now, I was very taken that he wrote that. Why? Because at least he's honest. He's not coming to say, listen, I'm an objective guy, and I'm doing my research, and whatever conclusion I'll accept. No, he's very interested in a particular conclusion, and that's that. Now, again, this doesn't necessarily say that this doesn't prove or disprove God. Karl Popper, the philosopher of science, the Austrian-British philosopher of science, writes, famously, that a scientific hypothesis has to be able to be disproven, not just proven, disproven. If you cannot disprove a scientific hypothesis, it's not science, because science is subject to the rules of proof and disproof. That's why you see theories come and go. Now, some theories withstand the test of time, but a theory is exactly that. It's the best working theory for what we have, and results and other ways of proving it and replicating, etc. And he gives the example. To say that God exists cannot be a scientific statement because no one can disprove it. Whether you can prove it or not, another, but no one can disprove it. That's why even the most radical atheists in their moment, if you ask them, are you certain, 100% certain there's no God? They'll never say that, 100% certain. They'll say, I'm also not 100% certain there are no fairies, as Christopher Hitchens, Olav HaShalom, said. Christopher Hitchens had a Jewish mother, as the three famous atheists of our time, Christopher Hitchens, Sam Harris, two Jews, and the third one, Richard Dawkins. He's not been yet found to be Jewish, but these are, Christopher Hitchens wrote, God is not great. Each had their books on this topic. So Hitchens has said a number of times, before he passed away a few years ago, he can't disprove it absolutely. But the burden of proof lies on those that believe, not those that don't. So this would be called, agnostic is someone who's in doubt, no proof either way. Atheist is someone who's almost sure or very sure, and so on. I'm not going to go through every particular level. I once wrote an article about this topic, and I was rudely reminded by a number of atheists, because I just piled all the atheists together, and they said there are many different, just like there are many types of believers, there are many types of atheists. I alluded to earlier, there are radical atheists, there are moderate atheists, there are average atheists. So atheism itself has many schools of thought. I think there's American Atheistic Society of America or something like that. So there you can go through, you can check it out online, if you happen to be interested in that. So going back to the topic at hand, so we're left with what? What are we left with there? Now, for those that do believe and do accept there's a God, there are those that just do it out of cultural reasons and don't give it much thought. They haven't thought about it too much. But those that have thought about it and have challenged it come to a conclusion that if there's indeed a God, that's the only reason we can talk about God, because God himself gave us information and embedded in our DNA ways to understand the Creator. So that basically essentially states that there is a given that if God created the universe, created it with design and purpose, and communicated that design and purpose, or else there'd be no point to existence and creation. And as such, God also revealed to us ways to communicate or ways to understand what God is about. Or in the words of the Bible, God created the human being in the divine image, and therefore we in our own personality, or as the book of Job puts it, from my flesh I behold God. If you study the art and you study the creation, which is created in the shape and image of the Creator, then you can get a sense of what the Creator is like. And that's going to be part of what I'm going to be discussing shortly in understanding God. But let's do this in a process of elimination, working our way backwards from the bottom up. I mentioned before, we have to determine what does it mean. Before we define what God is, we have to define what means existence. Or I better rephrase, what does reality mean? I've discussed this somewhat in my book, Toward a Meaningful Life, in the chapter on God. So some of these ideas, if you want to follow up, you can check it out in that chapter. I'm going to elaborate more than that is there. So I think the first thing that I think an intelligent approach to this has to be is looking at the tools and the logic and reason we use to determine anything. How do we know anything exists? So there were philosophers, I forget who by name, that argued and could argue, and anyone could argue this, that all of existence is an illusion. Can anybody disprove that? It's impossible to disprove, because any proof or disproof is part of the illusion. If, for example, like the Matrix showed, that all of existence as we know it is a computer program that somebody is controlling, so anything we come up with, proving or disproving, is all part of that program. So it's built in that you can't disprove that existence is an illusion. So how do we come to to accept that existence is a reality and not an illusion? It just simply, like many other axioms, that we just accept it to be that way. I don't know if you know this, but science, especially Karl Popper as well, and more than Karl Popper, also Gödel, the great mathematician, and similarly Heisenberg in physics, quantum mechanics, made the argument that, and has been accepted now as a scientific fact, that science, even with all its logic and reason, always has to have axioms that are not necessarily based on reason. Even mathematics, which was considered to be the absolute science, everything is provable. So Gödel demonstrated in the mid-20th century, which was very radical, but he proven that even mathematics is based on certain givens that just all mathematicians and all scientists accept. Because every system has to have axioms. And axioms do not necessarily mean they've been reasoned or proven. They're not irrational, but they're not necessarily a proof. I'll give you a classic example. It's accepted by all scientists that if you have several theories to explain a phenomenon, you choose the simplest explanation. Nobody knows why. It's just accepted that the simplest theory, the simplest explanation is the one that will be accepted unless it's disproven. Why? Because scientists, you could say the logic works that you try to find the simplest path to answer questions. But someone could say, how do you know? Maybe the most complex answer should be the one. Now, this is not meant to, this was the word I want to say, to discredit the scientific method. It's just meant to be honest about what science is and what it's not. So a real scientist will tell you, I don't need God to explain much of existence, or maybe all of it. Because I can explain how human beings evolved from apes, that evolved from lower species, all the way back to bacteria, to that ball of gas. If you ask me what was before the ball of gas, science has nothing to answer, because we were not there. We have no witnesses. and we're trying to figure it out. We have theories. That's what an honest scientist will tell you. Is it possible that God started the whole thing? Yeah. How could I say not? Again, a scientist who does not have any interest in bias or has no preconceived notions. That would be the approach. You could say, I can explain much without it, but I can't explain everything without it. But once I use God, the scientist will say, I've gone out of the world of science. We've gone from physics to metaphysics. Okay, that's a fair discussion. So I don't claim that I am an expert in that area, and I only can talk about phenomenon that I can relate to, or that can be discussed with some type of empirical or other forms of extrapolation that scientists have by consensus agreed to, and that's what we approach it with. But let's go back to what I'm saying is, so how do we determine? So the first axiom is that we accept that existence is real. It's not an illusion. Because if it's an illusion, all our discussions are meaningless. But if it's real, so then how do we define reality? How would you define reality? So the obvious, as I said, we'll start from the bottom up. The first way you define reality is by saying, my five senses. Since I've accepted that my eyes, what they see is real, and it's not an illusion, even though, of course, you can argue we see magicians, sleight of hand, and we could be fooled with optical illusions. But let's, for argument's sake, most things that we see, we can rely on. We all see this white wall. If you showed it to 1 million people, they'd all describe it the same way. So that's pretty much strong evidence that there is a white wall here, and that it's white, and that it's shaped so-and-so. Why? Because enough eyes have seen it and borne witness. That is considered to be fact. That's what we would call a fact. In other words, anything that our senses experience, let's say all of us would agree is a fact. Enough people heard a sound, you'll say, okay, I accept that, even if I didn't hear it. If enough people tell us that the George Washington existed a few hundred years ago, and there's news accounts, and there's enough witnesses and enough books and so on, you don't come to think, oh, there's a conspiracy of 50 people or 100 or 1,000 people that created an illusion called George Washington, and they just created forged newspapers and forged books and forged witnesses, false witness, and now we don't say that. Is it possible? Of course it's possible. But there's certain accepted verification, what we call facts. If enough witnesses, testimony from different parties, across the board. So this is called the empirical approach. And we'll take questions at the end, because since it's a class, and a lot of people, so if you don't mind. Okay, so this is, you have many, so our senses tell us a certain dimension of reality. But if you limit it to that, then comes the question, one second, what about things that the senses don't experience? And I mentioned one before. I mentioned love. Love. You say, I love this person. How can you empirically prove that? All you can say is, I feel love. Someone else says, I don't feel it. I believe you that you say it, but I mean, how do you measure the reality of this thing called love? How do you measure the reality even of love in general? So clearly you need something more than just senses. Because there's nothing that your eyes, your ears, your taste, touch, and smell can measure in what we call love. So then how do we know? Because we have other senses. We have supersensory tools. Since I know I can love somebody, so I can imagine that you can love somebody. So in a sense, it's through the common human experience that we can identify other realities. Same thing with ideas. Nobody's ever seen an idea. Ideas are creations of the mind. But because you come up with ideas, so you can accept that someone else comes up with ideas. Why would you not? So here you have a next level of experience which is not directly witnessed or experienced with the five senses, but nevertheless is considered to be also factual. Now, how far can you go with logic here? So you can go pretty far. Because now, let's talk about, let's say, I just spoke about conscious ideas. What about unconscious? Conscious ideas, as I said, you can experience through common human experience. But what about unconscious? How do we know there's an unconscious? And the answer is because logic dictates that if conscious mind is aware of certain ideas as we speak right now, and you know that you have many more ideas inside your mind that you're not conscious of, you have to say that your brain contains many other ideas that you're not aware of at this moment. We also know that human life experiences as children become embedded in our personalities. So any type of trauma that we experience or any type of positive thing affects our behavior later. That's not a conscious thing. That's what is called unconscious. Now, no one has ever seen the unconscious, but you can extrapolate what is called in Torah language, Yedias HaShlila, which means you can't see it directly, but you can infer, or call extrapolate, instead of intrapolation, there's extrapolation, that it exists. The black hole is a perfect example in physics of extrapolation. There are scientists and physicists that deny that there's the concept of a black hole, or what they call today black matter, black energy, dark energy, and so on. Because no one can see a black hole. By definition, it's black. How do we know it exists? So the theory goes like this, because when you see areas, large areas in space that are behaving erratically and are moving about in ways and you can't explain why they would be moving that way. So the theory that first Einstein posited and then he actually retracted and then came back to it is that there must be a body there that's exerting such a powerful gravity that's affecting the movement of anything that comes in its proximity. But no one's seen those bodies. You just see their effect. So, for example, if there was I was holding a magnet, right, on this side of a wall. You can't see me or the magnet. But you see on the other side of the wall metal pieces moving around strangely. So you can extrapolate and say, you know what? There must be something exerting energy that's causing an erratic movement of metal. So you can extrapolate and say, and infer there must be somewhere a magnet, even though you can't see it. Applying it psychologically to the unconscious, you could see, for example, a trained psychologist, therapist. I'm talking about a good one. There are many bad ones, but talking about a good one. Would be, what do they see that others don't see? You go to a trained person who's able to talk to you, able to have a conversation, and they can come away with somewhat of an understanding of your psyche that another person does not come away with. What is it that they have? Is it an instinct? Is it an intuition? Is it something you could be trained? So one of the ways to understand it, yes, clearly some people simply understand human beings better, or may have experienced themselves certain experiences in life, so making them more empathetic and can relate to other people who've had trauma or pain and so on. So one of the ways to explain it is the following. Like when you go to a physical doctor, medical doctor, and let's say you have a pain in your arm or a pain elsewhere, God forbid. So the doctor will ask some questions, then may examine you, and come away with, let's say you have pain in your right arm. Okay, touch here. And you start saying, oh, that's where it hurts. And it tries and feels it out, and gets a sense, if need be, to take an X-ray or CAT scan or another sonogram or something else, to try to understand what are the causes that the physical eye, the naked eye cannot see. So the trained physician, knowing human anatomy, having experience, can pretty much identify, not always, but can identify from symptoms causes that most of us are not trained cannot. No different than, for example, people who are very experienced in business can forecast certain things, not because they're prophets, because their experience has taught them to look for certain signs that the average novice cannot see. Anyone with a level of expertise, whatever area it is going to see things that the novice cannot see. You look at it, it'll look like random, someone else will see a pattern. The same thing is psychologically. A person who's trained can ask the right questions and can have a discussion and can learn from that much about your psyche more than you yourself may be even willing to share. Because they know how you respond. You study body language. For example, most of us, in areas where there's a lot of pain, psychic pain, meaning personal pain, psychological pain, we avoid. We don't like to discuss it, just like you avoid touching something where there's a raw nerve, a tender nerve. So a trained person who's asking questions suddenly sees, for example, you don't want to talk about your mother. And you say, is everything all right with your mother? Yeah, perfect, we have a great relationship, so let's talk about it. And if you see resistance, you can pretty much extrapolate there's something going on there. Now, I'm not talking about in any way an assault or anything that crosses boundaries and trying to, try to find out about someone's life without their cooperation. I'm talking about a trained person who will do it gently and sensitively. So think of